Hello, everyone. Welcome to the latest addition to our Sakamoto Blue Sky Micro Commission series. And we're here with Paul D. Miller, aka DJ Spooky, that Subliminal Kid, amazing musician and multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary artist. And that was his beautiful new composition, Butterfly Soul. So, welcome, Paul.
Hey, how you doing?
Good, good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm just enjoying a beautiful day in New York, and I'm sitting at a cafe playing some reggaeton in the background and enjoying a break from the heat. It got insanely hot over the last couple of weeks, so we're experiencing, climate change and all that stuff being what it is. I'm grateful for good weather.
Well, maybe we can touch on a little bit of that issue since Ryuichi was a big environmental activist. But first things first. So, Butterfly Soul. So, gorgeous composition. What was your inspiration behind the piece?
Well, there's a kind of I view Ryuichi Sakamoto's music as very empathetic. And when I say music that's empathetic, I mean like there's a kindness at the heart of what I think he approached thinking about sound. When I say kindness and sound, that might sound paradoxical, all puns intended. But from the beginning of when I hear his classical music compared to what he was doing with Yellow Magic Orchestra, there's a kind of cinematic quality because obviously he was composing a lot for film, plus he was acting, plus he was involved with design, thinking about environmental activism. And these are community-based approaches to sound. And I think that his music is like this layered relationship to minimalism on one hand. If you think about the history of Japanese electronic music coming out of more traditional forms like gaguku or taiko drums, there's an implicit minimalism in a lot of Japanese music that he was able to transform into a contemporary situation between both classical, electronic, and cinema music. And so that's kind of where my homage to him comes out.
Cool. And you perhaps you could share a little bit of your history with Ryuichi. You guys knew each other, you collaborated. Even can you tell us a little bit more about your relationship with him?
Sure. Ryuichi and his record label reached out to me to do a tour with him. And I said immediately, yeah, of course. I had met him through Ardo Lindsay and Diego Cortez, who Diego was an art dealer in New York who, was an eccentric guy. And somebody just rolling a desk down the street here.
So New
New
York.
York, you got to love it.
Yeah.
But the idea of how, when he came up with the notion of like, hey, Paul, can we do a meeting? I said, yeah, of course. It's Ryuichi Sakamoto, 100%. So I went by his office in the West Village. We talked about, the project was called the Discord Symphony. And the idea was that he wanted to do a series of meditations on the poetry of sort of a collision around cultural norms. And so he had Laurie Anderson and several other musicians join. And so a lot of it was pre-recorded. And I would record elements of the orchestra and then layer it against the orchestra itself. So that was where the dissonance and layering of collage was meant to be. So we printed out vinyl of the orchestra playing, and then I looped and layered that against itself. And then at the end, Ryuichi layered that. So it was layers and layers and layers. And I think that that's a really important sensibility that I think Japanese music comes out of as well. Because on one hand, at least again, from my interpretation as a downtown New Yorker, the notion of Japan as a kind of a critical region for both technology, the arts, and nuanced sense of how its history. The tuning systems the West uses are very different than their traditional Shinto and Buddhist approach to things. And if you look at Japanese court music like gagaku, which is these kind of minimal bell kind of tonalities, that's more kindred to Balinese gamelan and other kinds of very rich minimalist sensibilities out of East Asia. So it was a pleasure to kind of see how you turn in the material, and you never know when you make a piece what the person is going to do with it. Um, and it was a real pleasure to see how he edited it and then transformed it into all this nuanced material.
So just the vinyl thing, I just have to say, like that is, if what I'm understanding is correct, that's pretty amazing. So they recorded the orchestra on vinyl for you to be able to remix. That's pretty amazing. That's very cool.
Yeah, I mean, the fun part about it is that he was very influenced by people like John Cage on one hand and Karl Heinz Stockhausen on the other. And we'd have conversations, and we did like a large tour. I can't even remember, it was maybe 10 to 15 cities. We toured all over Japan, and it was, arenas, 10,000 people, 8,000 people a show. And then they were throwing a big after party afterwards at a Japanese club that would be in the city. And Ryuichi would, finish during a very uptight classical scene, everyone dressed in suit and tie and all this. And then next thing you know, he would be at the party and like hanging out. And I was like, wow, he's got double energy. It's usually when you do a show, you're kind of done when it takes a lot of energy and you want to wrap up. But with this stuff, it was really across generations. I always find it really interesting to see how people respond to things. So yeah.
And that was when?
Oh my God. If I remember correctly, let me, you know what, off the top of my head, let me look up Discord Symphony. I'm looking this up because my own memory is, I have a million things on my mind. Oh wow, 1998. Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
So that was fairly early on in your career. How do you have a sense of how that experience sort of affected your development and trajectory as an artist?
Yeah. From my perspective, the Discord Symphony was always a kind of a nuanced relationship because he named it after different emotions, and the piece was in several movements. There was grief, there was prayer, there was discord, so each movement was kind of relational to those emotional aesthetics. And emotion is really hard to present as a legible map. And of course, music is a map, one could argue. You're reading a text, you're moving through the text. So I like to think of, especially a written notated symphony by someone coming out of specifically, I mean, he was a classically trained musician who had come out of both electronic music and the revolution of personal electronics in the 80s and 90s. If you think about the 80s with the rise of the Walkman, portable CD players, and the way Japan dominated that, everything from Casio to Sony, Panasonic, those are highly identifiable technological inputs for New York culture. So, for example, the sound of video games, the sound of New York City, those are things that are implicitly built into like a boombox when you think of that time. If I say boombox New York, you're going to think kids breakdancing in the summer, somebody opens a fire hydrant in the street in Brooklyn or something. But if you zoomed in at the technology that the kids would have been dancing to, it would have been like a Casio or Yamaha or all of these kinds of Japanese technologies at the time. That later on, Taiwan and China became much more known for chip manufacturing and other kinds of things. But Japan spearheaded that as a World War II kind of recovery. And I'd say Sakamoto-san really was able to balance between classical music out of the Japanese traditions, and then on the other end of the spectrum, some of the Western traditions of, again, minimalism. I really think of Steve Reich and Philip Glass as more of a foundational kind of sensibility as well.
Yeah. In our my conversation with Carl Stone, who's also in the series, he was talking about how no matter whether he was doing pop or whether he was doing stuff for the stage or for cinema, even his like straight traditional analog instruments, that sensibility, that compositional and experimental sensibility and that minimalism was always somehow there. Along with his sort of melancholy, I think too. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, how his sort of core identity or taste or style as a musician or as a composer sort of carried through his career because he did so many things, but he was still him somehow.
Yeah, I mean, there's a cosmopolitan urge in Japan that I find incredibly fascinating. Like, I used to go to Jamaica every summer because my mom was the main what was one of the main art critics for the Kingston Daily Gleaner in Jamaica, and that's like the New York Times of Jamaica, and she would write art criticism for that. But you occasionally would notice a couple of wild things. One, that the Japanese loved reggae, and there would be like a Japanese sound system, and you'd be like, and they're really good too. I was like, wow. And if you go to Tokyo, there's a huge reggae scene. There's a huge Brazilian, there's samba. There's every style of music. And when the Japanese kind of clock into it, it's incredible because they're able to kind of both look at the DNA of that music and be a purist around it. And so hip hop, techno, dubstep, all of these styles of music, Japan has had an ability to both absorb and then have incredible practitioners in that field. So with classical music as well, I mean, I look at people like Yoko Ono as a vector for Ryuichi-san, but from the viewpoint of like her relentless sense of experimentation and looking at music and art as being parallel. They never really overlapped in the sense of like their projects and collaborations. But other people like David Byrne, Laurie Anderson, myself, Brian Eno, there's been a long history of Western artists embracing a Japanese aesthetic. So if you think about Yellow Magic Orchestra, the first one that really popularized them in the US was Afrika Bambaataa. And he had played a bunch of their records at various influential clubs. And so from that mid-70s to mid-80s, again, there was a transitional moment. You had bands like Kraftwerk on one hand, and they carried a certain kind of German minimalism into New York. And Afrika Bambaataa helped spearhead that. But he would also mix them with Yellow Magic Orchestra. And that's where I think you realize there's a global or more cosmopolitan approach to Japanese culture in the US and then reflected back at Japan. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, and I think you're right about, you're absolutely right about that connection in there that you cited earlier with early street dance hip hop technology, the technology that those kids were dancing to and the DJs were making music to, Roland, all of these Japanese brands, and also the music. I mean, when I think back to like seminal Ryuichi tracks like Riot and Lagos, which was a totally seminal popping funk styles track, from 1980. And most people, and still to this day, I would argue that most people outside of those circles don't realize how big a connection there was. The song that got relabeled Computer Games from YMO, also a big, funk styles track. So,
yeah, I mean, I'd say the two seminal songs from Yellow Magic Orchestra that really reached more of a mass culture perception was, Ride and Lagos, and the video, Computer Games was you mentioned. But also the film music, Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, those all touch different demographics.
Yep.
And hip hop, techno, dubstep, minimalism is a kind of a core theme in those styles. So I could say that Ryuichi was at the crossroads of all of that. And it's really an intriguing thing because he made sure to have a sensibility that was foregrounding the art. He could have been more of a oriented person, but he in Japan, he's a straight up pop star, but with a very refined sensibility. And he also just was able to balance that with relentlessly being curious about what's new, what's going on. And if you're a young musician just getting started out and someone like Ryuichi Sakamoto calls and says, hey, I heard about your music, let's have a coffee. You're wow. It hit me at a very young age, and I was like, wow, this is someone from a different generation who's checking out your music and being very supportive. So I just I view that as a very foundational moment.
Yeah, he Ken in my conversation with Ken Ueno about in the series, he was talking about how he met Ryuichi because Ryuichi friended him on Facebook. Just like, which seems like such an everyday regular thing for the rest of us, right? But and you would not expect that out of the blue, but that's how he worked. That was his brain. He was always curious, like you're saying. Um, so both you and Ryuichi and you are a environmental activist, also anti-nuclear, and other large social and society-wide global cause minded folks. Can you talk a little bit about that connection and, as a fellow traveler, sort of in that identity and pulling those strands together? And what does that mean to have a life like that and have a career like that from your perspective, from someone who's doing something very similar?
Yeah, I mean, I would say as much as possible, the most important thing facing humanity right now is climate change. And it's going to be a political test of wills around climate refugees, food crisis, education crisis. Those are all things that, again, I think Ryuichi touched on. And again, at an earlier age, I've been a climate activist from the very beginning of my art career. And I remember when Fukushima happened, Ryuichi did a project called No Nukes. And I did a series of initiatives just raising awareness about how the Fukushima Daiichi reactor is exactly the same as Indian Point, which is just up the road from New York. And it's built on the same architecture and the same blueprint plans. And so New York and Fukushima have a lot more in common than we would like to kind of think about. And if the Hudson River ever had a flood or a storm, Indian Point is like, boom, it's right there. So these are all things that are, it's kind of amazing that you have a nuclear power station on appropriated Indian land called Indian Point. I mean, it's just, the irony of America never ceases to amaze. But here we are. And I think he realized the cultural capital he could bring to bear on the issue inspired a lot of his music. I think later in his life, he was moving more and more. I think as much as possible, he felt that music was a message, and that message was getting people to think more critically and to be more aware of the world around them, and the fact that music and the arts can help intervene and change things for a better situation.
Yeah, yeah.
Or at least attempt. I mean, given the circumstances of our time.
Yeah, I mean, along those lines, what are your own personal thoughts about art making and social change and, like, next steps? Like, there's this beautiful legacy, like that artists like Ryuichi and others and yourself have built. Where do you, sort of what's next, either for yourself or for other colleagues or movements? What would you want people to be more aware of or to think about, or where do you see the biggest need for action in the intersection between arts and climate crisis?
Yeah, let me give you a fun, if not strange, example. There was a guy who was obsessed with all the birds that were listed in every work of Shakespeare. And the guy eventually went to the middle of Central Park. He collected them. They were all mostly British birds. And he said, hey, let me be an artist-oriented person. And it's like, again, it's a classic tragedy. What he ended up doing was importing all these British birds in cages and released them in the middle of Central Park as a lyrical kind of thing. And those birds then outbred and outcompeted the indigenous birds and began to be a huge invasive species. So I use that as a kind of a metaphor for when artists and creatives, it's like the Disney movie The Wizard, where the apprentice, the apprentice of the wizard opens up this Pandora's box, and so here we are. We've opened all the Pandora's boxes. Genetically modified organisms, like, and whether you look at that as our food crisis or food savior, for example. There was a piece I wrote where I went to Svalbard, which is an island far to the north, where they have this thing called the seed bank, and it's every major seed of every plant species, just in case, climate change is wiping out a tremendous amount of species. So that seed bank is going to be more important than ever. But a couple of years ago, it flooded. And because of climate change, the glaciers, I mean, So the list goes on and on and on. These are sort of strangely cautionary tales of human hubris. Um, and I've always felt that what I learned from Ryuichi was that the poetics of a composition, the poetics of a choreography, or the poetics of a conceptual work, they allow you to really question the world around you, and I think that's a very healthy thing. Um, and as much as possible, the lesson that I took away from that was like, okay, let's reboot how you think about the arts as a place of possibility. And that's just all I can say. That's, I would say, 100% the lesson I take from working with Ryuichi was that.
Yeah, no, that's great. Also, another legacy and thing that you have in common with him and a lot of artists is relationship with technology and media, and increasingly so later in his career when he would talk about not only what technology he was using then, but increasingly so what technology he wasn't using, and all he
Mm-hmm.
needed. For example, he famously repeated a number of times in the last few years of his life that at that point he really didn't care that much about the digital tools. It was really about the analog tools. So do you want to, I'm just curious if you have a perspective on all that, someone who's always involved with technology yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I write books and write compositions, and I write articles, and I'd say the current situation of artificial intelligence is kind of rendering a tremendous amount of human creativity at a very serious crisis or crossroads. One is that if you can do large scale language models and data sets of every possible song you could make, there's a company called Mewbird, which I always like to bring up. They have an AI that's generated over 100 million songs, and they have songs for every possible style. Like you want an action movie scene, music, somebody in the middle of a fight, or you want to play hard techno, or you want to gangster rap, whatever style, it's generated and populated all these different variations on those songs. And it's eerie because humans music is pretty relatively simple. I mean, your average song has maybe 3 or 4 chord progressions. It uses a relatively simple amount of notes, and that's for pop. Classical might have several more layers of complexity, but at the end of the day, it's relatively trivial to compute. So, from my perspective, technology is just one tool of many. And that's where again I pay homage to Ryuichi for that lesson. Um, I learned how to play upright bass, and basically I view myself as a hobbyist, someone who's always exploring and checking out stuff. You know, and a hobbyist is someone. It's very different than someone who's a specialist. A specialist is someone who really gets into one or two things, but a hobbyist can kind of become more of a broad brushstroke, so to speak, for looking at how these things work. And technology, as we can see now, every tool that you're using right now is going to be easy to synthesize, easy to have an AI replicate, and above all, once you think about any particular statistical portrait of your style, like if an AI analyzed every song I've ever made, they'd be able to statistically simulate what I would maybe choose. There's people who've done a mathematically probabilistic portrait of like Bach. There's people who are already doing this with Ryuichi's music because he chose certain notes and patterns. So you can already have a reasonably accurate portrait of what he would do. But what's the counter narrative there is that he would always have a different thing. So some of his stuff might be super minimal electronic, some of it might be just weird noise, some of it might be like an anti-nuclear anthem, so these are things where I think the idea of a piece is going to be harder to simulate than the actual notes a musician might choose. Whether that's good or bad, buckle up. It's the way it is. I'd say within the next 3 to 5 years, you'll be seeing use of AI at every level. And there already is. I mean, people are using it to, I'm sure you've heard about the video Fake Drake, where they had, that went viral, where these kids, they appropriated Drake's voice and then started rapping with the AI-driven voice simulator. And people didn't know if it was him or not. And the Beatles, Paul McCartney just did a duo with John Lennon. So pretty soon we'll have a whole bunch of new Ryuichi Sakamoto albums, maybe. And it's spooky. That's all I can say. It's just gonna. And I celebrate that on one hand because the human mind never ceases to amaze how, on one hand, lyrical we are, but also how pathological and bizarre we are as a species. And again, the reason I keep circling back, because we are doing this in homage to Ryuichi, is that I learned from him to celebrate the good, and to try and raise that stuff up, because the world is a bleak and crazy place already. Um, and these are things that I think the music and the arts that, again, people like him practiced are just helpful beacons of light in a otherwise relatively dark time.
Yeah. Well, finally, yeah, just curious, to close out, any last thoughts or feelings or words about his legacy, his memory, him as an artist, him as a human being? You were friendly with him as well. What did anything else to add?
Sure. I mean, at the end of the day, when you meet people from different generations, different races, classes, different, approaches to styles and music, you're always served best by keeping an open mind. And I think because I met Ryuichi when I was very young, in the late 90s, the takeaway was to be a lifelong learner and to always be open, regardless of generation, regardless of age, race, class, or creed. Everyone has something to contribute and to learn from. But at the same time, to keep things lyrical is to make a more open sense of possibility. We live in an era of formulas. If you go on Spotify, SoundCloud, YouTube, any of the every style of music is in some weird little category, and there's an AI or a bot waiting to recommend you the next song. I want to be someone who's like the anti-algorithm for that, where you might get unexpected situations, and those unexpected situations are where the human sense of creativity thrives. And again, that's where I would say my homage to Ryuichi is to learn to love that sense of continuous learning. I can't believe he's gone. It's really wild. I mean, I know that he was grappling with the cancer for a while, but I always thought that they had gotten rid of it, and then it came back very intensely, and that's what kind of got him. And I just want to say, the world is, we need more people like him to keep things personally kind of open and dynamic. And I think he's inspired millions of people. So that's what I would say was my lesson from that.
Thank you. That's so beautiful. Where can folks learn more about your work, Paul?
Currently, I'm taking most of the year off because I just bought a house and I'm in the middle of renovations. My website is djspooky.com. Late this year and next year, I have some albums coming out. I'll be doing a lot of environmental activist approaches to music in the next year. I'm probably going back to Antarctica to do a second edition of the book I wrote there. There's a couple of theater pieces I'm doing based on 1984, George Orwell's work. There's several albums in the pipeline, but for the moment, I'm just giving myself permission to just live and have peace and just not be as hectic as I normally have been. So yeah, djspooky.com, and everything's there: music, art, literature. I'm also working on three books at the moment, and each of one is about the way algorithms affect mass narrative, and that one's called Digital Fiction: The Future of Storytelling. The other book is going to be an AI generated book. I'm kind of championing this idea of fit hop, instead of normal hip hop, but using dance, using music to kind of reboot your sense of diet, because a lot of people eat a very unhealthy food. It's America. And I'm not vegan, but I like to think I'm vegan adjacent. I have fish and occasional meat, but health and music are really, I think, kind of intertwined. But so I asked an AI software that I'm working with to figure out some fun things about celebrating food with music. And that book, I'm going to just do it in a couple of weeks. In fact, I'm working on it in August. I'm probably going to have it done. It's a collaboration with a couple other vegan DJs. And that's going to be about food, art, and music. So yeah, those are all crazy projects. Keep life fun. But yeah, for the most part, the website has all that stuff. And thank you for checking the vibe. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, maybe a lot of us will be eating your recipes and listening to the music at the same time in a year from now. You can also, again, folks, check out the rest of the Sakamoto Blue Sky series at our website, fineartscenter.com, or on our YouTube channel, UMass Fine Arts Center. And again, this has been a presentation of our Asian and Asian American Arts and Culture program, which, for those of you who don't know, is the longest running university-based program of its kind in the country. We're celebrating our 30th anniversary. And thanks again to Paul D. Miller, aka DJ Spooky, and all the other artists in this series. And we'll see you soon. Take care.